and good morning. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak with all of you and to join you at the session. The European Green Deal has its scope of application in the EU, but for its proper implementation, it does require transformation of two essential conditions. Firstly, there is a need for a progressive transformation from a from a consumption-driven economy, rather, to a new form of circular economy that transforms and recycles natural resource. Secondly, new ways of obtaining clean energy without carbon dioxide emission into the atmosphere needs to be developed. My name is Bimbola Kolawole, and I'm the Business Development Manager for the Africa region at Rystad Energy. I recently qualified as a data scientist, and I have a pleasure to moderate today's session to discuss the topic Green Deal and the AU-EU relations. Again, just to reiterate, the AU is the Africa Union and EU is the European Union. And as introduced already, joining me today are Bezawit Esetu, the Ethiopian representative for the Africa Circular Economy Network. She is a biologist and chemist with more than 15 years experience on policy and program management in environmental management, sustainable development, waste management, resource efficiency, cleaner production, green growth, and impact investment with different United Nations agencies and private sector. She's also founder of the Circular Alternative. Second person joining me is Ali Zorali, Corporation and International Development Director at Moroccan Agency for Sustainable Energy, MESN. Ali is supervising the MESN project in over 20 countries across Africa and working to strengthen its position in power along with the Africa Development Bank for the benefit of the Sahel countries. Last but not the least is Dr. Anne Knappen, Policy Officer, Climate Change and Sustainable Food Systems at the European Centre for Development Policy Management, ECDPM. Han specializes in climate change adaptation within the context of Europe-Africa relations, with a strong focus on Africa, on agri food systems rather, and climate finance. You're all welcome, the panelists. So I'm going to start with Beza. Beza, you ready? In which
Yes, I
way,
am.
good, in which way do you see the AU-EU conditions and their trade implications, taking into account the Europe and Africa negotiation and joint partnerships?
Thank you, Bimbola. Pleasure to be here this morning with this panel. Uh, I think, in my view, in the 21st century, what drives market is a new trend which is emerging globally. That is the issue of sustainability. Consumer patterns and behaviors and lifestyles are changing in such a way that now, in this era, everyone is looking for the affordability, accessibility, and also sustainability. So, for African market to be competent in the European market, the issue here is how is the product developed in such a way that it fits into that global value chain, and that also affects how the negotiations, the trade negotiations and partnerships are carved along the path. The second and most important thing is the issue of resource depletion. We are no longer able to afford, we're in a phase where we have to think twice about this virgin raw material extraction, finite, which are going to be finite very soon. So it is about finding products and services which are sustainable, uh, alternatives which make sure that they are produced in a resource efficient and cleaner production approach. That's also another area where where the trade negotiations are affected or even empowered. I would say the reason being, for a product to be successfully uh, business feasible and economically profitable, it has to have that component. So, in my view, those are the two things that are really carving the path. The joint partnerships come in terms of in the form of policy dialogues across the two continents. The reason why I'm focusing on a larger scale on the continents is because now the discussion is AU EU, but the problem is, the opportunities also cascade down to country bilateral negotiations, policy dialogues, and legislative frameworks are now also binding the transaction across continents, across borders, and across continents. So that also really matters when you consider the trade transactions across the global value chain. The partnership also comes in terms of technology transfer, innovative approach, and financial schemes, which would be a win-win for both continents. That would be my view. Back to you, Bimbolo.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you very much, Beza. Han, I don't know if you have anything to add to Beza's points there.
Yeah, surely. I think Beza already made some pertinent points. I would like, in my response to this question, maybe take a step back and look a bit at the evolution of these Europe-Africa negotiations and partnerships before talking specifically about trade. And I think so. This is based on a lot of work that we have done, a lot of research, but also our interactions with African stakeholders. First, something like I would like to bring to the attention is a strategy that the European Commission brought forward in like more than a year ago. It was called the New Comprehensive EU Strategy for Africa, and there you see that green transition and energy is really one of the key partnerships, and also cooperation around climate change really runs throughout the entire strategy, and that shows that there is a very high political priority being given to climate change. And I think it will also be very high on the agenda of the upcoming EU AU summit, normally in February 2022. We are still waiting for the final confirmation. But however, if you look very closely at this document, so this new comprehensive EU strategy for Africa, you also see that there is a very strong focus on everything that's formal, that's productive, that's technology, and also mitigation. And our fear would then be that this would come at the detriment of the informal sector, but also adaptation, human development, and so on, which is so important for African countries. And you also see this when you look at the flows of climate finance from Europe going to Africa. This has not the focus on adaptation and resilience building has been less strong compared to um, funding going to mitigation to energy projects. There was a study done by ACT Alliance, an NGO, in 2008. They said that less than one third of climate finance reported by the EU institutions, so also banks, went to adaptation, and also considerably less, so like only 14% going to the least developed countries who need it the most. So that's one thing. This EU strategy for Africa, and then there is also, of course, the Green Deal that we are going to talk about a lot, I think, today. So the whole idea of this Green Deal is for Europe to become carbon neutral by 2050, which is very ambitious. However, if the EU wants to, this is like I think first and foremost an internal European strategy, okay? But in this interconnected world, the EU cannot do it alone, and this external dimension is extremely important. But many like of the policies under the Green Deal, such as new trade policies, farm to fork strategy, are also perceived by we hear that our African counterparts as being imposed on Africa, especially if you look at the new carbon border adjustment mechanism. I can talk more about that later. And then last point I want to make about Europe-Africa partnership is that in recent years there have been more building blocks of a joint EU-AU agenda, especially in areas like renewable energy expansion or the whole narrative around this global green recovery, build back better, and so on. At the same time, there are very like there are a lot of challenges also when it comes to adaptation. Again, finance for adaptation, and also the perceptions from the African side of potential negative economic consequences of this new Green Deal and the internal transition. And what I also think is that so far, there has not been a very strong, well functioning platform for Europe and Africa to engage. We have followed the work of the Joint Africa EU strategy, so the JAS, and this has committed to continents also to work closely on climate action. And I think it brought both on a political level both continents closer together. But in the end, when it comes to implementation, I don't think it has been very effective. The reality is also that a lot of the interaction between Europe and Africa, if we can say, happens more at the bilateral. I think Besa also mentioned that at the member state level. And also the African Union is also limited in its regulatory power. It's different when looking at the mechanisms within the EU. So yeah, and then looking at trade specifically, I think discussing trade in the context of the Green Deal is extremely many reasons for that. I think also the EU is the world's largest economy after China, is also one of the three largest international trade partners and very important trade relations with African countries, especially crude oil exports going to the EU and imports of refined petroleum products from the EU to Africa. But this Green Deal, it can have implications, of course, for in a good way. It's interesting for the green minerals market in Africa, such as cobalt, nickel, and so on. So that's positive. On the other hand, looking at the oil, like oil dependent countries like Nigeria, what will that mean? I mean, it could also create an economic fallout. And the same for the carbon border adjustment mechanism that I mentioned already. There is yeah, the fear in countries like Algeria, South Africa, Mozambique, Egypt, that are exporting steel, cement, aluminium, and so on to the EU, and they will have to abide by much stricter rules. So it's a legitimate fear, I think, that these countries have. But
Thank you,
yes,
Anne.
let me stop here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that broad feedback. Really interesting to hear. I have a question for Ali. Ali, is the European Africa dialogue on green transition acknowledging the different perspective and own needs, looking for win-win opportunity? And how successful is the diplomatic sensitivity being used by stakeholders' engagement to formulate, an African European vision for a joint transition to sustainability? Ali.
Thank you. First of all, I'm pleased to be here with you and to participate to this very interesting panel and discussion. I will answer definitely. It's a big opportunity today to set up a win-win relationship between Africa and Europe regarding all this topic of green energy transition. I think that it depends on African countries and African Commission. We negotiate in order to ensure that the needs of economic, social, and industrial development of Africa are addressed through this negotiation. The thing for me is that need from a position of recipient of grants from Europe to subsidize parts of economies or to accelerate only the access to energy transition through the use of sustainable and renewable technologies. And instead of that, Africa has to move to another position, which is to attract heavy industries and to attract, to enter into this circular economy. And I think that the needs and the opportunities are here from both sides. When it comes to the EU Green Deal, and my colleagues just mentioned the objective of the carbon neutrality by 2050, but also that EU will mobilize, for example, 100 billion of euros in order to accelerate this energy transition. And there is a big part that will go also to African countries and neighboring countries in order to support the EU strategy. So, in terms of production of hydrogen, if I can mention just that, EU is targeting to produce 40 green hydrogen inside its borders and gigawatt outside the EU border. So part of this production of green hydrogen or green molecules could come from Africa. So this is a first win-win opportunity that African countries need to seize. The second one, and which is for me very important, the main needs of EU countries is to ensure a security, a stability in the African countries and to limit immigration. And we see what's happening in the region in terms of insecurity or instability, for example, with the commitment of many European countries. So the only way to address this is to initiate and to stimulate an economical, a social, and an industrial development of the African countries. Otherwise, the immigration will to, to go to Europe. So maybe it's a very, so in terms of diplomats, have common interests. So now we have to transform this common interest into a common strategy and into a common approach that will benefit to both sides. And this is why I expect that from Europe, between Europe and Africa, that the nations will maybe result uh, on mainly transfer of technology. I'm sorry, there are a lot of noise behind, so I don't know where it's coming from, but I try to
Go
continue.
ahead. Go ahead, please. Yes.
So I expect that this new strategy or the negotiations for UA Green Deal will
Mm.
permit to stimulate this industrial and economical development in Africa, because we do not need just to export green molecules to Europe, but we need also to use these molecules into the process of transformation of heavy industries like aluminium, like glass, like steel here in Africa. This is the only way to stimulate an industrial development and an economical development that will make people stay in Africa and reduce the flows of immigration and also stabilize and reduce the insecurity. And this is of the interest of the European country. We need to learn from our experience. For example, less than 3% of the natural resources in Africa are transformed in Africa. And what we see, for example, for oil, is in sub-Saharan Africa, there is almost no oil refinery facility. So we need really to shift the mindset and to go towards more industrialization of Africa, based on this, stimulated by this discussion with Europe and this negotiation with Europe, and based on a sustainable development.
Hmm. Thank you, Ali. That's a very interesting perspective. Yes, indeed, I do agree with you. There's a need for a mindset shift, and industrial development is very important. Beza, I wonder if you have anything to add to what Ali has talked about so far.
I would like to reflect on a couple of sectors which would actually explain what the green transition can be when it is in win-win situation. Like, if we take, for example, textile, Africa is one of the largest second-hand clothes importers from Europe. But once it comes here, and then it, of course, it is worn, and then after the end of its life cycle, it ends up in the landfills. It ends up in the landfill and not get transformed back into fiber or any other changed material because we don't have the capacity to process it. It's the same story with electronic waste management. We're also again the biggest destination for second-hand electronic goods from Europe and elsewhere. But once the electronic use comes obsolete after it reached the continent of Africa, we don't have this capacity to process the waste, dismantle it, and make sure that it is disposed in a sustainable way. Again, the reason being we lack the capacity, we lack the financial capacity to process it, including the institutional capacity and a lot of policy barriers and gaps. But this shows you that's where the key area of win-win niche can be created between the two continents. If the capacity is built bridge, if there's a bridge to fill this capacity gap, then we will be in a position to process the waste, the complex waste, most of them hazardous waste coming from elsewhere, and then also make money out of it and livelihood out of it, jobs created out of it. Environmental greenhouse gases also decreased, and emissions are also decreased. A lot of things come cascading with it. So those are the views, in my opinion, where the complementarities and the partnerships and collaborations come into picture to create a win-win solution for both continents. Thank you, and I move back to you.
Thank you, Bezard. Indeed, yes, the capacity probably isn't there, and hopefully there will be that, and that's the intent. As Ali said, there has to be a mindset shift, and these things needs to start to happen in house, and of course, a win-win collaboration remains. Han, I'm going to pivot to you. If you can give me a response to this, and I'll say in 5 minutes if you can. Sustainable transition in agriculture is key, and agriculture is particularly vulnerable to climate change. About 60% of Africans work in this sector. So currently, the Green Deal lacks a reference to international climate change adaptation. Why isn't this a prominent aspect in the EU relation with African countries, Anne?
Okay, thank you. A very good question. I think you say 60%, it may be even more because so many people work in the informal sector, and I'm not sure are being captured in this number. But it's true, when the Green Deal came out, I looked at it from an adaptation perspective, and there is no mentioning. There's also no mentioning of gender, by the way. But then what is very important is that the Green Deal is actually built on about 8 pillar documents. One is also circular, I think important for Beza's work. But there is also this EU adaptation strategy that came out in February this year. And I think we should focus on that because it has a very important external dimension. It really acknowledges the need only act within the EU borders, but also support developing countries. There is also a special focus on least developed countries in Africa and in Asia as well, and on small island development states. So the SIDS, and they also look at potential cross-border climate impacts. Also in this document, they underline the need for a social, inclusive transition when building resilience. I think that's important. And but in the end of the day, we have to see like how much financing will actually go to adaptation. They also try to be ambitious. They're raising the bar for climate activities within the current 7-year financial program of the EU to 30%, including adaptation. And you see that institutions such as the European Investment Bank, the EIB, wants to become a climate bank, and they just last week agreed on their adaptation action plan. So this is promising. We will have to see at the end. I think one of the problems is that this adaptation strategy lacks kind of quantifiable targets, although the European Parliament had asked for that. So I think they are just at the initial, like in the first stages of implementation. So we have to see in the coming years how much the EU will actually do on adaptation. But maybe to elaborate a bit, there is another Green Deal policy, which is the farm to fork policy. A colleague of mine, he did very interesting research on this, a briefing that just came out last week titled "A Greener Europe at the Expense of Africa." So what he says, and I kind of support this argument, is that have a farm to fork policy that wants to make Europe more green within its border, much more organic agriculture. As a consequence, there may be less production. That can lead to higher global food prices, and also the need for African countries that are already exporting a lot to Europe, agricultural produce. They may need to produce more, but this can come at the expense of the environment. It can also cause more emissions because they have to produce not only for their own market, but also for the export market. We already see that a lot of export-driven systems are monocultures in African countries. So focusing only, if you think of Kenya, but also olive oil in Tunisia, really focusing on export towards the EU. This a consequence of a farm to fork policy can mean that this will only happen at a much larger scale. At the same time, you have adaptation policy that looks promising and ambitious. So we have to look also not only at what will the final implementation be of the adaptation strategy, how much finance will go to adaptation, but also how coherent are these Green Deal policies if you put them together, if you actually implement that.
Interesting view. Thanks for that. But yeah, I hear you on the, I'm actually interested to read that article that your colleague wrote. So maybe I'll ask you about it later. On the greener Europe at the expense of Africa. Indeed, that is, for African countries that export to Europe. Of course, it will put a strain on them. But then again, there's also a huge consumption in Africa because we see it is the youngest continent. It's going to continue to grow. The population is, expanding and just, exploding even. So yeah, it's an interesting view. But while I have your attention, and I'm just gonna get your attention for another 1 or 2 minutes, how will climate change then affect food security? And
yeah, I think that's a key question. And I think most people know already the answer, that there is a direct link, of course, between climate impacts and food security and all aspects of food security, not only food production and availability, also access to food, quality, utilization, and stability of food systems. So this is basically the definition of food security. And just to give you some numbers, according to the IPCC, agricultural productivity in sub-Saharan Africa will decline from 21 to 9% by 2080. So it's still in the future, but even on a short term, because of droughts, because of flooding, but also because of increased pests and diseases in plants, in crops, there we can expect a continued decrease of agricultural productivity. And this brings me to another aspect of this, that climate change is basically a threat multiplier. So if people have less food to consume, this may cause them to change livelihoods, to move to be displaced, to move to other places, to produce their food. This can lead to conflict. So there is a very important security aspect linked to that. And then so that's, I think, to respond to your question, but also another aspect is the idea of transboundary climate risks that is now also within the UN FCCC negotiations getting increased attention, political attention also, and in many aspects that we have been looking at is that there is a very high import dependency. For instance, in West African countries, my colleagues studied there on the rice import dependency from Asian countries. I did work on Tunisia, where I think for more than 60% people are dependent on maize imports coming from Ukraine, from France, from the US, also Canada. But what if climate impacts are affecting the production there in these countries that are exporting to African countries? This will have also important implications for food security. So in these consumer countries in Africa, because there is in such a case, if there is less production in exporting countries, they will try to feed their own market first, their own population first. So this will have implication. I mean, it's very important also for countries to build their own buffer at home, and to take into account this concept of transboundary climate impacts. Yes,
thank you. Thanks, Anne. Thank you. Very interesting food for thoughts, so to speak. Thank you. So now I'm going to ask, I have a question for Ali. Ali, accelerating the access to renewable needs, managing energy transition, and challenges from a planned phasing out of fossil fuel, such as job losses and stranded assets. These are issues that needs to be addressed. So what are the critical issues here? Especially with job losses, stranded assets. I mean, by stranded assets, I'm talking about oil assets, gas assets. When it comes to the green agenda, not being able to to produce, no investments going into, fossil fuel production, basically. What are the issues here? Ali, we can't hear you, I'm afraid.
I need to turn on my micro.
Yeah.
Globally, for me, it's well known they need less jobs to operate renewable energy facilities than to operate fossil fuel facilities. So, in terms of jobs development and needs, it depends on the signification or the meaning we give to energy transition in Africa. So if we mean by energy transition to accelerate the access to electricity and to, because we still have more than 40% of people in Africa that don't have access to electricity. So if we mean only the access to sustainable electricity using renewable technologies, I don't think we will achieve our objectives in terms of job creation and initiating a positive dynamic of economical, social, and industrial development. While, in the same time, if we take the meaning of accelerating the development industry, meaning using renewable energy, because Africa is blessed with extraordinary potential in terms of renewable energy, solar, wind, hydro. So if we use that to increase the competitiveness of African industry, because before in my last comment, I was saying that 3% of the raw materials and African resources are transformed in Africa. 97% are exported, then we are imported as a finished product. So if we want to use, and if we look why this situation, we will see that one of the main reasons is the lack of sustainable and competitive energy. Africa pays the most expensive electricity in the world, with an average that is exceeding 20 cents the kilowatt hour. And this doesn't allow the emergence of an industrial dynamic. So now, if we use this green transition as a new green revolution that will bring more competitiveness to the African industry, meaning transforming the natural resources, the wind or the solar or the hydro in Africa to provide electricity less than 5 cents the kilowatt hour in Africa, which is possible for industries. It will help to attract heavy industries that will use tremendous potential in terms of renewable energy to ameliorate their competitiveness, but also to avoid paying carbon taxes that will enter into will be applied, for example, in from 2023. So I repeat, it depends on the meaning this energy transition. If we understand energy transition just to get access to energy for the 40% of African people access to energy, and we do not initiate a shift in terms of mindset, and we will remain as consumers of European technologies and developed countries' finished product. If we mean by that, if we consider the renewable energy or renewable molecules like a raw material that will be used mainly in Africa in order to ameliorate the competitiveness of, and we will initiate a new positive dynamic, and we will enter in a circular economy based on the principle of green transition. And this will help to stimulate the economical and industrial development of African countries,
Thank
and
you.
then
Thank
create
you.
jobs.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I believe in you. Thank you. Beza, do you have anything to add to that, please?
Yes, a couple of points actually. I am very happy that Ali raised the issue of industrial efficiency and symbiosis. The reason being, yes, a lot of African countries have subsidized, highly subsidized uh, electric supply, and the access is a very limited. But in order to meet the coverage, to increase the coverage, and then of course to make sure that the cost recovery is maintained, the prices will be increasing. So the alternative is to use renewable energies, but that comes with another higher initial investment price of investing on solar powers, wind powers, or even geothermal and all other things apart from oil. So that's where the issue of who sponsors or who sees the commercial value of tapping into that resource is interesting. The reason being the private sector is not yet developed here in Africa, so we end up still looking out elsewhere outside the continent to finance the whole scheme. That's something that we should also improve, empowering and engaging the private sector to co-risk and to de-risk and also co-finance with the public sector, because the capacity of the public sector is always limited when it comes to budgeting for the bare minimum, and then beyond that it's a bit difficult. So I would say the public-private partnership is key here to increase the capacity of the continent to tap into the renewable energy resources. It could be investment from the European counterparts or within the continent, but in any case, that partnership is key. The second and most important thing, in line with the industrial efficiency, is the productive use of the generated electricity power itself in the first place. Diversifying it, using it for more productive use and more impactful products and services is where the selling power of, I would say, the transformation is. An investor looking it from a private sector's point of view, I would be interested. If I am an investor, I would be interested once the energy is generated and my investment is taking its toll. I would want to see the product that was that was produced using the energy generated is profitable. So those
Mhm.
are the two key things I would say are the key for the selling factor for the renewable energy transformation in the continent.
Thank
Thank you, and
you.
I give you back the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Biza. I'm going to pivot back to Ali. Ali, if you can give me your response to this within, I'll say within 1 minute. We're pressed for time. So, Ali, has the international public finance provided sufficient support for green transition in the past?
I think that there is no a right answer. In terms of available green financing, I think that it's more than sufficient. But there is an issue, is that there is an offer that doesn't match with the demand. When you travel in the African continent, you see that all the ministers, even Mr. Dr. Saleh in Ethiopia, all the ministers are seeking for more financings to accelerate their strategy. And at the same time, when you talk about GCF, CTF, and all the GA5s, you will see that they have the financing, but they don't find the bankable projects where to put all this financing. So there is a mismatch. And for me, I'm quite distressed and sad about this situation because we do not really understand, or we do not design the right tools that will support the development or the acceleration of this green transition and the development of renewable energy. What we need is certain kind of financial tools that will be used, for example, to as PRG, partial risk guarantee, in order to facilitate or to secure the offtake side. And so each time an African government wants to use concessional financing and green financing, they need to put on the table the state guarantee. And put on the table this guarantee, it's less money that you can use for social projects like health, like education, and so on. So what I see is that all the tools that today proposed are not really adapted to the African needs and African objective, and we need to wait in order to put on the table the right financial tools that will facilitate the development of renewable energy projects.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Ali. Well, we could go on forever. This is a very interesting topic. I am enjoying every moment of it. And I hope the listeners are likewise. So I'd like to end this now. And many thanks to our panelists. And of course, again, most importantly, to our listeners for joining us today. And I hope you have learned a thing or two, or three or more from the discussions we've had today on the green the EU relations. So thank you so much for your time, and do take care. Enjoy yourself wherever you are. Again, thank you for joining us on the Green Deal EU relations. So much to unpack, such little time to discuss on it, but we hope to see you again. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day. Take care. Bye now.